LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, author Eric Barker teaches our curator, Daniel Pink, how to make friends, disarm marital conflicts, and spot liars. If you've been listening to this show for a while, then you've probably heard us talk about the Grant Study. Back in 1938, scientists decided to do something that seemed simple on the face of it, but which turned out to have a profound influence on how we understand human happiness. These researchers decided they were going to document the physical and emotional health of 268 Harvard sophomores for the rest of their lives. Who thrived and who floundered? Who succumbed to vice and who triumphed over it? Most importantly, who lived long, happy lives? Here's what they learned. The best predictor of happiness in life isn't how much money you make or how famous you are. It has nothing to do with your IQ or your genes. As the study's lead researcher, George Vaillant, put it, the only thing that really matters in life are your relationships. When he heard that, author Eric Barker was filled with despair because his relationships were not great. But that despair soon turned into excitement. You may not be able to change your genes or your IQ, but you can change your relationships. They're malleable. Eric went deep on the art and science of relationship building, and the results can be found in his new book, Plays Well with Others. In addition to being a bestseller, it was chosen by our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, as one of the 8 best books of the year. And today, one of those curators, Dan Pink, is going to sit down with Eric to talk about why we all need to tend to our relationships if we want to live healthy, productive, and meaningful lives.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Next Big Idea Club conversation with one of our great selections. It's a book called Plays Well with Others: The Surprising Science Behind Why Everything You Know About Relationships is Mostly Wrong. And the author is with us today. His name is Eric Barker, and he's a great American. I've known him for a few years, and we're going to get to know him a little bit and talk about some of the really cool ideas in this book. Eric, welcome.
It's great to be here, Dan.
So, Eric, before we get into the substance of the book itself, let's talk a little bit about you. I think it's interesting sort of how writers get to a particular topic. So take us through sort of where'd you grow up and what was the trajectory of your early life?
I was born in Philadelphia, raised in South Jersey, went to school in Philadelphia, and I was a screenwriter in Hollywood after I graduated from college. So it's always funny to me talking to other authors, because some have never really professionally written before, some were journalists before. You were a speechwriter before, and it's like, for me, I came from the land of action movies and animation.
So when you were a kid, did you want to be a screenwriter did you want to be like a movie person when you were growing up?
Yeah, when I was in high school is when I first started thinking about writing. And then at one point it dawned on me that somebody actually writes these movies and that I could actually do that. And that was a very big step. And so it was in college that I realized that, hey, let me see how the screenwriting thing works.
Now, you went to the University of Pennsylvania, which is not notorious for its film program. So tell us about that. What'd you do there? What'd you study there? And how'd you make your way from that part of Philadelphia to the mean streets of Hollywood?
I majored in philosophy undergrad, which doesn't really have
sense.
A clear direction afterwards anyway. I think initially I was going to find a mountaintop and contemplate joblessness. And so it was while I was in school, a friend of mine started working in Hollywood, and he was like, hey, why don't you come out for the summer? So I did 2 kind of pseudo internships, like not formal. And that's how I started meeting people. And that's how I was like, hey, yeah, this would be really cool. But no, there was no formal pipeline at all. It was this hodgepodge, but oddly, it kind of worked out.
And so I want to come to the screenwriting here in a moment, but I also want to say that, 100 years ago, I started talking about how we needed to merge these 2 degrees, the MBA and the MFA.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, you're like one of the few people on the planet who has both. How did that happen? Tell us how you got to get an MBA and an MFA.
It was strange. It wasn't at all intentional. But yeah, I graduated Penn, I moved out, I started writing. I got lucky pretty fast. I got an agent, like within a few years, I had a couple movies made, but my friend had done this awesome program at UCLA where because it's in LA, because it has strong connections to the film industry, the MFA program, that's called the producers program, is like all taught by industry professionals. All the classes are 7 to 10 p.m. So your class in Hollywood legal is taught by the head of Sony Legal. Your head in producing is taught by somebody with an Oscar. And so it was really great. And it was a fantastic program where I knew I'd meet people and I'd learn a lot more about the industry. That was my MFA. Then after a few more years in Hollywood, ups and downs, crazy stuff, I was like, you know what? Maybe I should try something else. That was the MBA. And then I did my MBA internship at Nintendo, and I went to video games for a few years. But it was actually in the MBA program that I took a class on negotiation that exposed me to a lot of social science. And that's actually where the rumblings of my blog began, because I really got fascinated by that. And it was after I graduated into the post-2008 crisis that I started my blog. And so in 2009, I graduated my MBA, I started my blog, and it was very funny because I was kind of balancing these 2 things. And eventually I left my job in video games to pursue the blog full time, which led to the books.
Right. I mean, it's a fascinating. I mean, I think it's a really interesting story because, I mean, there's no way. Like, first of all, if you go back to your screenwriting days, you would not have ever architected a story that began in South Jersey, winded its way through the leafy campus of University of Pennsylvania, a detour into Hollywood and the UCLA MFA program, then an MBA program and a stint in video games, followed by some blogging that turned it into these great books. So I think it's helpful, especially for some of our younger listeners, to hear the trajectory of successful people like you and recognize how profoundly and deeply nonlinear it is. And how one has to be opportunistic about those kinds of things. So, and risk taking. So, you got your Ivy League degree when everybody is going into finance and consulting, and you pulled up stakes and, went to Southern California to type. During there probably were not a lot of people in your MBA class who came out of that MBA program and started blogs. So I think it's super interesting, and I'm glad to hear that story. So you have this blog, super successful. You have your newsletter, blog barking up the wrong tree, newsletter barking up the wrong tree. It's one of my favorite newsletters of all time. It's massively successful. You have a giant audience. It's just so profoundly and well done. That leads you into these books. This is your second book. And here you decided to take on this topic of relationships. Okay, so this is a book about relationships and a lot of the kind of social science that undergirds relationships. Why a book on relationships, Eric?
I mean, 2 reasons, actually 3 reasons. First and foremost, when I was writing Barking Up the Wrong Tree, my first book, it was all about kind of the myth busting the maxims of success we all grew up with. And, Freud said, life is all about work and love. And so to me, they kind of bookend each other, that my first book was, about like work, career success. The second was about relationships. The second reason was relationships were not something that I was really good at. I think that's part of the reason why I was fascinated by it. And I was kind of curious on a personal level. But then what was very strange was after the book deal closed, literally 2 weeks later, California locked down for the pandemic. And I was like, okay, I'm not the only one who's probably going to need this book. I was thinking like, I hope this isn't too indulgent. I mean, I know relationships are important. I know people need them, but this is kind of like a personal journey. And then it's like, okay, this is a journey we're all on because we're all going to need like the relationship defibrillator when this thing is over.
And what's the third reason?
Oh, no. Number one was Freud. Number two was my personal interest. Number three was the pandemic.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it. All right, I had conflated 2 and 3 because, as you know, I'm a devout Orthodox Trinitarian. So if you tell me you're going to have a list of 3 and you only give me 2, I am not going to let you off the hook. But I think that's interesting because I think it's true for a lot of writers that at some level all research is me-search. And so that we're trying to figure these things out. But I think one of the things that's interesting, Eric, about your book is that at some level the word relationships, I don't want to say that it's soft, but it's a little softer than, say, work and success and those kinds of things. And yet you make a pretty good case in this book that it really matters. Tell us a little bit about how much relationships matter to our both emotional and physical well-being.
Yeah, it was crazy to see that some of the research literally that in terms of health, you've got like everything from the Grant study at Harvard, which, longitudinal study that followed, a group of men for their entire lives. And George Valiant, who led the study for most of the time it was there, he was interviewed. Here's a study that had lasted decades. And interviewers were like, what did you learn? And instead of giving some long diatribe of the, warehouse full of insights, he came back with the only thing that matters in life are your relationships to other people. And he found correlates in terms of, health, happiness, so many areas. And in terms of both health and happiness, one study showed that relationships are, second only to genetics. It's really, really critical. And we give it lip service, but I don't think it's something that we pay a lot of attention to. And then beyond that, I think relationship book, it's kind of right up there with the word infomercial sometimes. It's not really taken as seriously as we should.
The Grant study, I think what's to me compelling about that is not only the effect of relationships on our overall well-being, but on our physical health. That is, it matters to like our cardiovascular health, to our endocrine health, to the various biological systems in our body are improved when we have healthy relationships. The other thing about it that I think is the value of the book, going to one of the factoids that you gave, is that our relationships are second only to our genetics in our well-being. So CRISPR notwithstanding, it's very difficult to alter our genetics. But we can do something about our relationships. Now, give me one more beat on this because I think there's a converse side. I think there's a flip side to this relationships, which is you mentioned some of the research. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you mentioned some of the research on loneliness. A couple of years ago, we selected Vivek Murthy's book together about the epidemic of loneliness. Give us a little bit of for those who haven't read that book, give us a little bit of texture on loneliness and the deleterious effects that it has on people.
John Cacioppo was the leading researcher on loneliness. And, what he found was the elevation of stress hormones caused by loneliness is the equivalent of a physical attack. Like loneliness is like getting beaten up. It's staggering. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but not by much. But it's correlated with basically almost every negative health outcome you can imagine. Yeah. And which is terrifying because I was in pandemic lockdown writing about loneliness by myself, living by myself, not seeing friends, reading about how terrible this is for you. And I'm just like, I'm like I wrote in the book, I'm surprised that like insurance companies don't mandate that you like spend more time with friends. It wouldn't be a bad idea. But it was funny. I read Vivek Murthy's book, and it was one thing was really interesting was he hit on something that I thought was critical here, which was the issue of loneliness is horrible for you. However, solitude is actually protective against loneliness. And that distinction is really critical because what Cacioppo found was that loneliness isn't about proximity. It's not about merely physically spending time with other people. Basically, he found that lonely people don't spend any less time with others than non-lonely people do. And we've all felt lonely in a crowd. You can relate to that.
Exactly.
Loneliness is how you feel about your relationships. So if you feel bad about your relationships and you're alone, that's loneliness, that's bad. If you feel good about your relationship, but you have time alone, that's solitude, and it's a positive.
I think that's such an important distinction. And you mentioned it, you cite some data in the book, which I think is often presented as an alarming problem, but you put it, I think, in better context. Forgive me, Eric, I'm not going to get this slightly wrong, but something like 1 in 7 Americans lives alone. Is that about right?
Roughly. It's been increasing. Like, the numbers have just been up and to the right.
But 100 years ago, it was close to like 1 in 100.
Yeah, and the craziest thing is we're not even, the United States is not even number one on that. A lot of European countries and the Nordic countries, the majority of households are one person. So this has just been increasing, and there's really strong negative effects there. We don't have kind of the community, the support, the people around that we used to. And when you combine that with a lot of the reasons, like Faye Alberti, who teaches at the University of York, did this fascinating research where she looked back historically. And the word lonely didn't used to have the negative connotation that it did before the 19th century. She exaggerates a little bit and basically says that loneliness didn't exist before the 19th century because we were all embedded in a group, a religion, a tribe, a nation, something. So we felt connected to other people on an emotional level, even if we weren't physically proximate to them. And now with the rise of individualism since the 19th century and the breakdown of a lot of those institutions, if we don't have those connections to friends and family locally, we also don't have those big picture tribal connections that always made us feel we were a part of something.
Yeah, and when we talk about friendship here in a moment, I want to come back to that idea of, you use the word embedded, how an embedded set of relationships is more nourishing than a kind of disaggregated set of relationships, even if it's the same number.
Yeah,
I thought that was a super very, very interesting point in your book. Okay, so here's what we know. We know that relationships matter deeply to our physical health and our well-being. They matter as much as, that matters second only to genetics. Their relationships are something that we can control. We know that we have, from Vivek's book and some of your book, a serious problem with loneliness, which is not only about people living alone or solitude, but it's about people feeling disconnected, people feeling that they lack something that you say toward the end of the book, a lack of sense of belonging. So let's start out talking about the two main kinds of relationships that people have in their lives: friends and romantic relationships. So companion relationships and romantic relationships. Let's start with friendship.
I mean, friendship makes us happier than any other relationship. Sorry, spouses. The interesting thing about friends is there's this interesting kind of aspect to it where, friendship is kind of the stepchild of relationships. There's no formal institution backing it. It's like marriages are enforced by law. Your relationship with your employer has a contract. If you don't take care of your kids, the state is going to do something about that. But your friends, there's no institution behind it. So friendship doesn't get the attention, the support. Nobody we go to a marriage therapist, you can go to a child therapist, there's no friend therapist. And that is a weakness in terms of friendship doesn't get kind of the attention, the dedication. But the flip side is that's one of the reasons why friendship is so powerful, is it's never an obligation. Is that your friends are only there because you like them and they like you. It's 100% voluntary. So therefore, its fragility proves its purity. So we get so much from it because the only reason they're there is because you want them to be. So it stays honest. And because of that is Daniel Kahneman's research that shows, friendship increases subjective well-being more than any other relationship.
It's something that I had not thought about, this idea that we don't have the force of law or the force of religion or state action behind friendships. They are, they're entirely unregulated. They're sort of the Bitcoin of relationships, right? So they are probably not the best analogy for the idea. And so friendship is deeply, deeply meaningful. And it's interesting you say that, because in some other, the last book that I wrote about regret and what people regretted, one of the things that people regret the most are not reaching out and not maintaining connections. And they end up being so much about friendship, not so much about family or anything like that, so much about friendships and the pain that people feel when these relationships sometimes drift apart. Now, so give us some guidance here, because this book is like your newsletter and blog. It's chock-a-block with some good news you can use tips. Give us some guidance based on the science about how do you form a friendship? Like, how do friendships form?
Well, it was interesting because taking that Mythbusters approach, the first thing I looked at was the reference that most people use, which is Dale Carnegie. And the funny thing is, Dale Carnegie wrote his book long before the advent of social science research, but the majority of what he said actually got proved out. The only thing he was wrong about was he talked about seeing things from the other person's perspective, and we're actually really bad at that. Nicholas Epley's research at University of Chicago showed like we're not good at reading other people's minds and coming at it. But everything else that Carnegie talked about was, really true. Was, paying sincere compliments, focusing on similarity. It's like all of these things have benefits. The only thing is, Carnegie wrote his book largely for business relationships, for contacts. Yeah. And there's a number of lines in there. You can see it's a very strategic book, about getting things from people and influencing people. So it really doesn't get to, the deeper levels of friendship that we want to. It'll get you to the acquaintance phase. What's really critical in terms of building deep relationships, the ones that last, like you said, the ones that people regret when they lose, are we need to send and look for costly signals.
Boom. This is such an important point. So let's give us so you talk about friendship depends on costly signals. Tell us about that, because I think that's a huge takeaway from this book.
Yeah, I mean, basically, how do you know if somebody's just, a callous manipulator, trying to get stuff from you, just trying to act like a friend? Is costly signals, a principle from economics, is the idea of signals that are quote unquote, expensive to send. And that's what we should show. That's what we should look for. The first is time, because time is always scarce. If I spend an hour talking to you every day, I can't do that for more than 24 people, and I got to sleep. So time is scarce. Scarcity means costly. So time is really critical. And one study from Notre Dame showed they tracked 8 million phone calls, and they found that people that stay in touch every 2 weeks, those were the relationships that were more likely to last. So touching base is really critical, spending time when people need you. And the second is vulnerability, is opening up. Because if I tell you things that could hurt me, that could make me look bad, that could be used against me, that is a strong demonstration of trust. And Diego Gambetta is a researcher in Italy who looked at it. And the best way to build trustful relationships is to first demonstrate trust. It's easy to say, but to actually tell people, here's things that are embarrassing. Here's things I might not want to be public. That says, I trust you by doing it. And very often people will reciprocate. Getting back to what we talked about earlier, there are major health implications of this, where Robert Garfield at University of Pennsylvania found that not opening up, not being vulnerable, increases the chance of a heart attack and doubles the chance that heart attack will be lethal. We need to kind of like release some of the PSI on the stress, the problems we're dealing with, and we do that by opening up to others.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of disclosure and vulnerability is fascinating, because it is potentially costly. If I were to reveal to somebody something that I'm not proud of, something that I did wrong, something that makes me look bad, it's a risk, because that is potentially costly. And you described, give us one beat on this kind of, almost this kind of choreography that goes on in friendship, where you don't divulge everything all at once. That's too costly.
Yeah.
You make a little small investment that's reciprocated with this. Tell us about that.
Yeah, basically, like, don't confess to any murders up front. Make it incremental. This is research by Daniel Hrushka, which showed that basically it's like start small, build. Start small, wait for people to reciprocate. If they do, escalate. This is actually a mild formula, for building deeper friendships, is say something that's kind of silly, say something that's small, and, if they reciprocate, graduate that. Like in the book, I talk about the scary rule. If it scares you a little bit, that's a good sign that this would be something worth, opening up about. And if you incrementally increase it in that way, this is powerful. Arthur Aaron, did research, and he made people feel like lifelong friends in under an hour just by having people go back and forth, revealing things about themselves, on an increasing the deepness of it. And two of the research associates that he had on it ended up getting married.
So this is smart advice. So if you want to create a friendship, build a friendship, you want to transmit costly signals, devote time, and vulnerability. And that vulnerability is sort of this kind of incremental disclosure and counter disclosure and so forth that can unify. And you say, if it's, your scary rule was like, if it feels uncomfortable, that's probably a good idea.
Yeah.
You talk about sort of maintaining contact maintaining, I think you just mentioned a moment ago, the 2-week kind of check-in rule. So you want to nurture that. So there is, I think one of the interesting things about the way you've written this is that it suggests, I think sometimes we have this idea that relationships just blossom. Like the prairie grass in my backyard after a Washington, D.C. rain, when in fact, it's much more, we have to bring a lot more intention to it. So costly signals and then this 2-week rule.
Hey you, I'm Andrew Seaman. Do you want a new job? Or do you want to move forward in your career? Well, you should listen to my weekly show called Get Hired with Andrew Seaman. We talk about it all, and it's waiting for you, yes you, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey folks, Rufus here. If you're a fan of our interviews with physicians, scientists, or entrepreneurs, then I have the perfect podcast recommendation for you, Raising Health. Previously called BioEats World, Raising Health comes from leading venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, A16Z. Each episode, Raising Health dives deep into the heart of healthcare, biotech, and AI with A16Z general partners. Along the way, they explore the real challenges and opportunities in health and biotech entrepreneurship. Not to mention, you'll hear raw insights and actionable advice from notable guests like Omada CEO and co-founder Sean Duffy, and AI expert and In-Sitro CEO Daphne Kohler. Don't miss out. Follow Raising Health wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's talk about work, friendship at work. More important than we realize, huh?
Oh, really critical. It's like people who had more friends at work. Research showed that they were happier with their life. Not happier at work, they were happier with their life. And people who were friends with their manager, it was a dramatic increase in workplace satisfaction. We draw a boundary there that's sort of artificial. Our brains don't draw a distinction between contacts and friends. And it's really important to feel something organic there and to feel that devotion. Otherwise, it's going to be really artificial.
This point about boundaries on friendships is also really interesting. I think it comes out in a number of different ways in the book. So not only this boundary between our work selves and our self-selves, where you say, just as you said a moment ago, that having a friend at work increases our life satisfaction. Yeah. You also talk about a couple of interesting things, which is there's some research showing that when we become good enough friends with people, the boundary between ourselves can dissolve. Explain that.
Yeah, so it was funny. I was looking for there was a crazy problem I had writing the book, in the sense that when I was writing about romantic relationships, the amount of research is staggering. It's like, because of marriage therapists, there's a whole institution here that has been looking for answers to these problems. With friendship, I had the exact opposite, which is there is no institution. There's not much research. So I was really scrambling to look for decent stuff at first, and I actually ended up turning towards ancient philosophy as like a start. And Aristotle has this great, quote where he says, "A friend is another self." That makes for a fantastic quote on Pinterest. But I was like, this isn't science. And then I kept looking, and actually it had been proved out by the literature that basically that when we become close to someone, when we feel empathic towards someone, that basically our self-definition and our definition of that person starts to overlap like a Venn diagram. Yeah. And increasingly so. The closer you are to someone, the more the overlap. And this was tested pretty rigorously. When you put women in an MRI and mention their friend's name, their best friend's name, the areas for self-processing in the brain light up. When you ask people about their close friends, it's like, is this personality trait true of you or true of them? The closer you are to the person, the longer the lag in the answer, because your brain has to disentangle you from them to say, is that me or is that, it's really crazy. But those are the kind of another self, sort of friendships that we're going for.
Right. And the other thing is that this is, after all these years, your ability to quote Aristotle is a sign that your Ivy League education is finally, after a couple of decades.
Mom would be proud. Mom would be happy.
Philosophy major. See, Mom, I know who Aristotle is, and I can quote him and then connect it. And then my liberal arts education allows me to connect it to some fMRI research. So there you go. Money well spent. But I do think this area of boundaries is really interesting, sort of like how bounded ourselves are, both in terms of our roles that we play in our lives and with other people. One last point on this, which I think is connected, is you talk about relationships. You used the word earlier, embedded, and the idea that friendships that are embedded in something, that are part of a bigger community, are actually more nourishing. I did a pretty bad job of sort of explaining that, so explain it better.
No, it was really interesting in terms of, in one section of the book, I talk about friendship. In the other section, I talk about community.
Yeah.
And there's this interesting distinction here because I think community is really broken down. Friendships broken down a little bit as well. But what's really powerful is this idea that one-off friendships, if you have 5 friends and they don't know each other and there's sort of this one-on-one friendship, that's fulfilling. That's great. But it's not as powerful as when your friends know each other. When your friends know each other, now you're taking that step from friendship to community. And
exactly.
There's a powerful increase both in well-being, but also the feeling of support. Because now if you share something with 5 friends separately and they don't know each other, maybe they're helpful. But once friends know each other and you say, I'm feeling down, I'm having problems, your friends can coordinate to help you. That just adds an entire another level. This word's a little abused, but it's synergy. There really is this kind of 2 + 2 does equal 5 when all of a sudden your friends can work together to take you out, make you feel better, to help you find a new job. That ability to coordinate isn't there when they don't know each other. So we see how friendship and then community is really a whole nother level, and there are added advantages.
So you have 5 friends who don't know each other, then 5 friends who do know each other. To me, for whatever it's worth, that I started thinking of like our brains and how our brains are integrated in that way. And maybe there's something in the way that we think that finds that more evolutionarily advantageous. Okay, so let's shift from friends to romantic relationships. And let's begin with something. I'll show one of my many, many pet peeves. People who say, my spouse is my best friend. God bless you if that's the case. I find that I don't love that, and I'm apparently not alone. There's some national differences there. Tell us about that.
There was huge variability. One study in the United States, double-digit percentage of people who said their spouse is their best friend, and I think it was in Mexico City. They surveyed people, and the answer was 0. It's like that. That's not required. It's like friendship and romantic relationships, are distinct. And we might be better off in some ways if we realize that distinction. Friendship is a big part of it. John Gottman, the leading researcher on romantic relationships, does say that, over the course of a long-term romantic relationship, the friendship is the critical part to focus on. However, it is only part. They are not the same.
Right. Tell us a little bit more about Gottman, because in this realm, I think it's important at some level to know who he is, why he matters, and some of the things that he found. Because it seems like even though there's a huge amount of research in relationships, a lot of roads lead back to him.
Oh, absolutely. The critical thing that's fascinating about John Gottman is that, with so much of, early days of psychology, early days of all of this, it was very, look at Freud, it was very speculative. And with romance, we have we have the desire to have more of a narrative, a little more magic. We appreciate that. John Gottman has a math background. John Gottman was a mathematician, like hardcore. And so he really brought to the study of romantic relationships a level of scientific rigor that just had not been seen before, and just went to extreme lengths to be able to isolate those variables. He has a love lab where literally couples will move into an apartment, that is just wired with, cameras, audio, everything. He did tests, he had people hooked up for blood pressure, hormones, everything, to just see all of the minutia, what was going on in couples interactions, over the course of days together, not like, a 15-minute study, and getting all of this data. So it just gave us all this like rigorous level of analysis that hadn't been seen before. So he is undoubtedly the number one guy in the field.
If you had to pick sort of Gottman's greatest hits, like if you have the Gottman playlist on Spotify, what are the first two tracks like of what Gottman found out? Would you say some of the stuff he did looking at video?
I mean, he found some staggering stuff, and news you can use in the sense that just by listening to the first 3 minutes of a couple's argument, he could predict the ending with 96% accuracy. Basically, he just saw again and again in these studies that if it starts out, harsh, it's going to end harsh. That was really critical. Other things he found was, his 4 horsemen, the 4 things that predict doom, which were criticism, stonewalling, defensiveness, and contempt. Those 4 things predict divorce like 81% of the time. And it was really fascinating to sort of disentangle the first one, criticism. We think, couples complaining a lot. Complaining isn't a problem. What's a problem is criticism. The distinction being complaining is to say, here's an issue. Criticism is to say, here's an issue and you're at fault and you're a bad person and it's due to your fundamental personality. And so to realize that those 4 things, criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt, were really predictive of divorce, that was powerful. The other big Gottman insight that I would point to is Gottman rose to fame on the issue that by just listening to a couple for 5 minutes with 90+% accuracy, he could predict whether or not they'd be divorced in 5 years. And the way he does that isn't some really mathematical, crazy algorithm. He asks the couple to tell their story. And if it's a story that celebrates the struggles and moves upward, that is a very positive sign. And if it's a story that sounds a lot more negative and focuses on the negative, that's a really bad sign.
Yeah, it's fascinating. To me, what I find really compelling in some of the Gottman research is this notion of contempt and how incredibly toxic that can be. I mean, if you have contempt within a romantic relationship, I agree with him that it's essentially over.
He described it as sulfuric acid for love.
Exactly. So it's really noxious. I think it's super interesting. And yet, there is some evidence, though, that in our romantic relationships that endure, I don't mean to diss the friendship part of romantic relationships, because there is a sort of a trajectory of sorts, isn't there, in how very healthy romantic relationships will move. Tell us about that.
I mean, roughly, after 18 months, a lot of the big, explosive romantic feelings tend to die down. There is kind of a romantic entropy, of sorts. And usually that's okay. Usually that's a movement from, the more romantic forms of love to what's called companionate love.
Exactly.
But the other thing is, you can keep those romantic feelings alive. The issue is that people think, oh, well, when we were first dating, we were in love, so we did all these exciting things together. But actually, that relationship works both directions, which is you fell in love because you did exciting things together. We have this, there's emotional contagion, is what they call it in psychology. Basically, that whatever environment we're in, we tend to associate the feelings we have with the person we're with. So if you keep doing fun, exciting stuff, you can keep those more thrilling, excited, feelings for your partner. When we settle into too many Netflix and pizza Fridays, that tends to die down. And there were studies where they had couples, that one cohort go on pleasant dates, and they had another couple go on exciting dates. And exciting won, hands down. It really boosted their happiness.
That is truly, I mean, because we want to bring this back to me, of course. Truly, one of my margin notes is I have, and the reason I remember this is that I showed it to my wife, which was excitement, and then I put like greater than, like the greater than sign,
Yeah.
pleasantness, and then also just like excitement and novelty, and how continuing to do those things actually is extraordinarily healthy. And I actually had a conversation with my wife about that based on what I read in here and based on that little mathematical rendering of this complex point. So, and yet in our romantic relationships, we don't always get along. So, but you have some advice on how to argue better. How?
I mean, first and foremost is like those first 3 minutes, it's like if it starts harsh, it's going to end harsh. It's like take a deep breath, pause. It's like if you started out talking about the issue, not criticizing the person, that is a fantastic start. The other thing Gottman found, because the Gottman's Four Horsemen has gotten a lot of publicity, and that's great because it's true. But there's an escape clause there. There's another aspect to it, which is that plenty of couples have one or two. They've got a couple horsemen riding around, and that does not necessarily spell doom because of what he calls repair, which is maybe you are expressing more criticism. Maybe you do stonewall. But in the midst of an argument, if you take a step back, metaphorically, and make a joke, laugh, hold their hand, say something nice, you can undo some of the negative that is done by those. We talk a lot about compassion, but the best use of compassion is in the midst of an argument. Couples who show more compassion and sensitivity during an argument, have less volatile arguments, and they have them less often.
Right. So there's some really really good takeaways there. Beware Gottman's Four Horsemen, which are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. Go for excitement over pleasantness, particularly as a relationship goes on. I never thought about it this way either, this idea that the causal arrow runs both ways on the newness and the excitement.
Yeah.
And then, so go for excitement as much, if not more, than pleasantness. And then show compassion in the midst of an argument. So I hope my wife is listening to this. So let's, you also have some good advice here, and we'll go through this a little bit faster. You also have some good advice on sizing people up. And I found that there's some very, very good stuff on here. So for instance, let's talk about first impressions. There's the old line, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And so is that true? Do we care about that? Are first impressions meaningful? And are they useful gauges for us of when we assess potential friends or potential romantic partners or potential colleagues?
There's definitely a germ of truth to that, in the sense that when we're talking with someone who we know, our ability to read their mind, to know what's going on, to kind of intuit where they're coming from, we're not very good at that. That's roughly, with strangers, we're at roughly 20% accuracy, with friends 30%, with spouses 35%, which basically means 2/3 of the time, whatever you think is on your spouse's mind, you're wrong. But what's
incredible. This is the Epley research that you mentioned earlier.
This is Epley. Now, here's where things take an interesting twist, and that is when we're first meeting someone and they're making a first impression, we're actually surprisingly accurate. About 70% of the time, we size people's global personality traits up pretty accurately, and they would match, that person, they would match what others think. But again, 70%, if your kid brought home all D's, you wouldn't be too thrilled. So, 30% of the time we're wrong. So we're good. But here's the double-edged sword of first impressions, and that is we're right more often than we're wrong, a lot. However, once we're wrong, confirmation bias kicks in. Once we've made up our first impression, now our brains are not objective scientists looking for the truth. Our brains are lawyers vigorously defending the positions we hold, looking for things to confirm what we already believe. So if somebody makes a bad first impression, they can get stuck because we're the store that updates our beliefs is not open for business. And it's very, very difficult. And that leads to continuing problems because for us, if we meet somebody for the first time, they don't make a good impression. If we have the option, what might we do? Not hang out with them anymore. So our negative impressions are always going to be less accurate than our positive impressions. Your positive impressions, you see them again, you get the chance maybe to update your beliefs. So you're getting a bigger sample size versus negative impressions. It might be somebody who's having a bad day and they're not going to get a second chance.
Well, do you think we should give, is the lesson of that we should give people those second chances?
Absolutely. I mean, we should, be cautious, but it's like we should give people that second chance because otherwise there's no appeal. And by the same token, the other big takeaway from this is to think about your first impressions, the ones that you make, because as we see, people are going to lock onto those. And it's going to be really hard to correct any errors they have about you once confirmation bias kicks in.
What are one or two tips you have for either conveying a better first impression or for more accurately interpreting the first impressions of others?
I mean, for more accurately interpreting, most of that is unconscious. The truth is that it's like, if you look at the research on thin slicing, people can watch a video of a teacher teaching a class for 5 minutes without sound and, often predict how competent a teacher that is. The issue we have really is confirmation bias. The issue we have is we have to realize that the verdicts that we're making are not final. So the war, it's less about, kind of the Rosetta Stone of trying to read people's body language. And it's a lot more about going, oh, they're a jerk. Okay, I'm getting the feeling they're a jerk. Let me test this theory before I immediately go with my intuition. Let me pound on this a little bit. Let me ask them another question. Let's change the conversation. Let me see if my theory, can be proved wrong.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into something else that I wanted to talk about, which is first impressions, is body language.
Yeah.
I remember hearing about body language years and years and years ago. And, I've always been, I don't know the research very well, but I've always been like slightly skeptical about its value. And I think your book has done nothing to dampen that skepticism. So, what do we know about body language? And in particular, you have one item in the book that says there's something better to do than watching people's body language.
Yeah, this is work by Albert Friedge, which is really, really interesting. Just basically, the body language isn't a consistent predictor of lies. There are no consistent, like I said, there's no Rosetta Stone for body language because the issue is we never really know where it's coming from. Is the person shivering because they're nervous or are they shivering because they're cold? We don't know. We don't know contextually, like if they had a horrible day and that's why they're angry or because their legs are crossed. We don't have any kind of things. Body language, specifically within a person, because the biggest issue with effectively using body language is if we have a baseline.
Exactly.
So if you don't know somebody, body language is pretty useless. But as I said, the Epley research, friends were higher. We could read friends better than we could read strangers. We could read spouses better. Part of that, unconsciously, is certainly we're picking up lessons as we go. But without a baseline, it's pretty much useless. And what's really critical, the point you raised, is we do have something better, and that is voice. If you can see someone, but you can't hear them, empathic accuracy drops off more than 50%. But if we can hear someone, but we can't see them, empathic accuracy only drops off like 4%. So, So focus on the voice.
Yeah. I thought that was super, super interesting. Follow your ears rather than your eyes. I think the point about baseline when we read body language is also interesting. Yeah. I tend to be a slightly fidgety or
me too. Me too.
And if you know me, it's like, okay, that's just how he is.
Yeah.
But I can see how that can be, and probably has been in my life, misread as like, oh, this guy's really kind of fidgety. I wonder if he's really telling the truth, or he's really uncomfortable. It's like, I'm not uncomfortable in the least. I'm just a little nuts. And that's my baseline. But I think the point about voice is, so I think baseline is a really good point for body language. And I think what you're also talking about, both body language and first impression in general, is be humble about how much you know and how accurate you are.
Yeah.
Intellectual humility can go a very long way on that.
The Next Big Idea is sponsored by the Next Big Idea Club. That's right. The Next Big Idea is more than just a scintillating podcast with a debonair host. It's part of the coolest learning platform on the planet. Here's how it works. Every season, our curators, Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink, handpick dozens of the best new books. Then we partner with the authors of those books to create book bites. These are 12-minute audio summaries written and read by the authors themselves, and the only place you can find them is in the Next Big Idea app. And that's not all you'll find once you download it. Our app also has beautiful audio and video e-courses, ad-free versions of this podcast, bonus author conversations, and lots of other mind-expanding content. Download the Next Big Idea app today. Better yet, do it right now. Pause this recording, go to your app store, and search for Next Big Idea. Getting smarter has never been so easy.
So let's bring us home with, I think, some of the most useful advice, at least for me personally here, is liars. Okay, so we've got, first impressions, we've got body language, we've got detecting liars. First of all, there is just a boatload of lying going on out there. Your numbers on the amount of lying was sort of disheartening to me. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like all the stats on lying I literally had to cut that section down with the data.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a lot of lying going on. We lie the most to mom. My assumption is that's largely so she doesn't worry. We lie to our spouses the least, but we tell them the biggest lies. So there's plenty of lying going on, and most of the advice we get is terrible. Is just terrible. The polygraph doesn't work. And what was funny is it was actually developed in part by William Moulton Marston, who is the guy who developed the DC Comics character Wonder Woman. And the lasso of truth worked. The lie detector does not. Again, much like we talked about earlier, it's like somebody feeling stressed out, their blood pressure going up, their heart rate going up, sweating more. These are not necessarily correlated with lying. We don't know this. And if people can be stressed for many reasons, not the least of which, they're hooked up to a lie detector. So it's, that hasn't been valuable. What was really valuable was finding out that basically after 9/11, there was a lot of government research, by social scientists to try and figure out, for interrogation, for other purposes, what actually works. And this was really powerful to realize that the perspective of stress is not a good model for detecting lies. What is called cognitive load, which is that basically lying takes a lot more mental horsepower than we realize. You have to think about the lie you're telling. You have to think about the truth. You have to think about what the other person's perception. You have to update that in real time. You have to make sure they're not catching on. That's a lot for your processor to be doing. And the best way to detect lies is to further up the cognitive load. And there are a number of methods for doing that, but the most accessible and usable of which was to ask unanticipated questions. And what's really fun is I was reading this research and saw everything, and it's now used by airport screeners at airports. And I was going to a wedding in Prague in June, and an airport screener came up to me and started asking me, "So, where did you go while you were in Prague? What are you doing?" And I'm like, I'm on the other end of this research right now, which made me incredibly nervous. But I wasn't worried because nervous doesn't impose a lie. Anyway, point was, right, they do use this. So it's really powerful to ask unanticipated questions because a liar cannot prepare for every question you would ask them, and they're going to have to think. When police officers were told, don't ask yourself, does it seem like this person is lying? Ask yourself, does this person have to think hard? And just by asking, just that change in question dramatically improved police officers' abilities to detect lies.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. So I thought that was such useful advice. It's like, is the person having to think hard about what they're saying, and also surprising them with that unanticipated question. You have a good example in there, just to make it a little bit more concrete about
At the bar?
IDs and drinking. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So if you were a bartender and someone came into the bar who was, clearly underage, if you ask them, how old are you? They're going to say 21. That's rote. We all know, what the proper thing. But if you were to ask the person, when were you born? What is your birthday? That's a very easy question for someone who's telling the truth, but someone who's lying is going to have to do some math. So all of a sudden, that creates the biggest kind of delta. That creates the biggest change where here's a question that every person who's telling the truth can say quickly, and someone who didn't take the time to falsify the year they were born is that's really powerful.
Because they're doing the math in their head.
Yep.
They are, to use your language here, you're making them think. You say, oh, wow, they're thinking hard here. And that's a sign of, so sweatiness, jitteriness is not a sign of lying necessarily. It could be, in fact, a very false signal, but are they thinking hard? I think that's so useful. So lots of useful stuff in this book. One last question for you, Eric. So you now are the relationship guru here. How, if at all, has this changed your own relationships, your own friendships, or any romantic relationships, or your connections with your family?
I mean, the writing of it is the hard part in that sense, because, oh God, I'm doing that wrong. This is like my whole career these days is just reading, researching. Oh, I do that wrong. So that's the hard part. It's a constant staggering list of all the things I'm doing incorrectly. But that said, afterwards, it's always a positive because I can try and improve. For me, it's like I'm making the time for my friends, making sure I'm staying in touch. And I have not been a paragon of vulnerability in the past. So just opening up about those things, it really makes a difference. It really makes a difference when people know where you're coming from. They know what you're dealing with. They can help. It's amazing how poor people are at helping when they don't know what's wrong. So it's made a difference.
It's astonishing sometimes how bad people are at reading our minds. So it's amazing. Maybe that's the next book. But this book is a great book. This is Eric Barker, famous for Barking Up the Wrong Tree, the mammothly successful blog turned newsletter. I think that he plays well with others, and that's the name of his book, Plays Well with Others, which is just chock-a-block with all kinds of great evidence-based insights and tips on how to build relationships. Eric, thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
That was author Eric Barker speaking with our curator, Daniel Pink. If you'd like to hear more from Eric, you can check out his previous appearance on this show. That episode is called Relationships. You can also try downloading the Next Big Idea app. There you can hear Eric share the 5 key insights from his book, Plays Well with Others, in just 12 minutes. And Eric is just one author among hundreds. Nowhere else on the planet can you hear folks like Walter Isaacson, Anne Lamott, Greg McEwen, and Arthur C. Brooks share the key insights from their new books directly with you. To get started, all you have to do is download the Next Big Idea app. If you enjoy this show and want to support us, the best thing you can do is recommend the show to a friend. The second best thing is leaving us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. We love getting your reviews. We read every single one, so keep them coming. Today's episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger, sound designed by Mike Toda. Our executive producer is Michael Kavnat. We play well with the team at LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.